Power always thinks it has a great soul and vast views beyond the comprehension of the weak. John Adams wrote that over 200 years ago, and in many ways, we're living in the world he dreaded. He and the other founders didn't just create a new nation. They left us a user manual filled with warnings about the dangers to avoid. They specifically designed a republic to resist being ruled by a wealthy few, but their greatest fears might just be our modern reality. So, how do we get here? We're going to break down the specific warnings from Madison, Jefferson, and Washington about factions and oligarchs and show how America arguably ignored them. We'll look at the key moments where we took a wrong turn and examine the evidence that suggests our democratic experiment has produced the very thing it was built to prevent, an oligarchy. When the Constitutional Convention wrapped up in 1787, a woman supposedly asked Benjamin Franklin what the delegates had made. His answer was cautious and, it turns out, prophetic. A republic if you can keep it. That phrase is so important. Notice he didn't say a democracy. The founders were actually pretty skeptical of pure direct democracy. They had studied their history and saw how easily a majority could turn into a mob and steamroll the rights of everyone else. Their solution was a constitutional republic. And that wasn't just a different word. It was the heart of their design. A republic was meant to be a government of laws, not of men, managed by elected representatives instead of the shifting whims of the crowd. To do that, they fractured power, splitting it across three branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. This system of checks and balances was the machine they engineered to keep the republic safe. It was built to stop any one person or any one group from grabbing too much power. It was supposed to be a defense against both a tyrant king and a tyrannical majority. The founders understood human nature, the temptations of power, and the corrupting pull of money. Their design was a brilliant attempt to build a system that could withstand our own worst impulses. But even the best design is only as strong as the people who come later are willing to defend it. The founders weren't just architects. They were also prophets of how it could all go wrong. And two dangers in particular kept them up at night: factions and oligarchy. The clearest breakdown of this threat came from James Madison in his famous essay, Federalist No. 10. He defined a faction with a clarity that's still stunning today: a number of citizens ... who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. To Madison, factions weren't a bug. They were a feature of human nature. He figured that as long as people have different opinions and different amounts of money, they'll always form groups to protect their own interests. And he pointed out that the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. In other words, he knew the biggest threat was the clash between the rich and the poor. This fear of factions was tied directly to the fear of oligarchy rule by the rich. You had Thomas Jefferson worrying about an elective despotism, where a new, wealthy aristocracy would use its money to control the government from the inside. John Adams feared that people without property would have their judgment controlled by a rich man who had tied their interests to his own. They all understood a simple, timeless truth: concentrated wealth will always try to become concentrated power. An economic elite wouldn't just be happy being rich. It would use its resources to bend the government to serve its own agenda, not the common good. This wasn't some abstract problem. To them, it was the logical endpoint for a republic that wasn't careful. What Washington called the baneful effects of the spirit of party in his farewell address. They could see the seeds of an American oligarchy before the ink on the Constitution was even dry. So, if the founders gave us all these warnings, how on earth did we get here? To see how we got from their vision to our current reality, we have to look at the moments where America's path forked. The first big test came in the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. The rise of industrial titans, the robber barons, created fortunes that were almost unimaginable. Men like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan didn't just build empires of steel and oil. They built political machines. They used their fortunes to buy politicians, write favorable laws, and crush their competition. This was Madison's fear in the flesh, a powerful economic faction whose private interests consistently trampled the public good. Now, the progressive era in the early 20th century was a direct fight against this. America pushed back with antitrust laws and campaign finance rules. For a while, it looked like the Republic's immune system was working. But the fight was far from over. That brings us to the next critical turning point, the last few decades of the 20th century. A new wave of deregulation and economic policies started to undo many of those old guardrails. Wealth began to pool at the very top at a speed not seen since the first Gilded Age. And then came the legal earthquake. In 2010, the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United v. FEC completely changed the game. In a 5-4 ruling, the court essentially said that corporations have the same free speech rights as people, and that the government couldn't limit their independent political spending. That decision opened the floodgates. It's what gave us super PACs, which can raise and spend unlimited cash from corporations and billionaires to influence elections. The court's logic was that this would lead to corruption because the spending was independent. But as we've all seen, that assumption didn't exactly pan out. In the years since, we've had an explosion of outside spending, much of it from dark money groups that don't even have to say where the money came from. This one decision effectively legalized the exact thing the founders feared most: the ability of rich, powerful factions to use a tidal wave of cash to drown out the voices of everyday citizens. It was the moment Madison's nightmare was practically written into constitutional law. So that brings us to today. Is the US an oligarchy? The evidence is pretty unsettling. In 2014, a major study from professors at Princeton and Northwestern looked at about 1,800 different government policies over 20 years. What they found was devastating. They discovered that the preferences of the average American have a minuscule, near zero statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. On the other hand, economic elites and business groups have a substantial impact. Put simply, what most Americans want doesn't really affect what the government does. The researchers didn't mince words, concluding the US is not so much a democracy as it is a functional oligarchy. And the years since have only seemed to prove their point. Take a look at recent election cycles. Billionaire spending has skyrocketed since the Citizens United ruling. The amount spent by the 100 wealthiest Americans in federal elections has jumped by nearly 140 times since the year 2000. In 2024, for instance, roughly 1 out of every $13 spent in national elections came from just a handful of the country's richest people. This isn't just about campaign checks. It's about what that money buys: access and influence. It's a system where billionaires can pour millions into a candidate's super PAC and then, not surprisingly, find themselves in a position to help shape policy. As former President Jimmy Carter bluntly stated, America has become an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery. This is that conversion of wealth into political power that political scientists talk about. It's a new Gilded Age, where tech founders and hedge fund managers have taken the place of the old robber barons. We're living in a system where economic and political power have fused together, creating a feedback loop that just keeps benefiting the wealthy few. This is the exact elective despotism that Jefferson was so afraid of, where a republic's democratic machinery is being run by and for an oligarchy. The founding fathers weren't starry-eyed idealists. They were realists who understood history, power, and human nature. They knew the republic they built was fragile, a delicate experiment with some very clear vulnerabilities. They gave us the blueprint for success, but also a detailed list of warnings about how to fail. James Madison warned us about factions driven by money. George Washington warned us about the poison of hyperpartisanship. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams warned us about a new aristocracy of wealth capturing the government. Over the last 2 centuries, it seems America has struggled to heed those warnings. We let factions harden into warring political tribes. We let a new Gilded Age be born. And with a single court decision, we arguably legalized the unlimited influence of money in politics, creating a system where the wants of billionaires can outweigh the will of the people. The result is a government that looks less like the republic the founders designed and more like the oligarchy they feared. They built the ship and pointed out the icebergs. It seems like we've been steering right for them, but what do you think? Is this just what happens when a society has this much wealth inequality? Or are there ways to rebuild the guardrails the founders first put in place? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and if you find these kinds of historical deep dives valuable, think about subscribing and hitting the bell icon so you don't miss our next video. In the meantime, you might want to watch our video on the fall of the Roman Republic, a story with some chilling parallels to today. We've linked it on screen and in the description. Thanks for watching.